calling the previous government's labor reforms jobs killers, including the final proposed hike that was to put the minimum wage to $15 an hour. The current Ontario government is setting a new course on the labor file. At the same time, the unemployment rate is hovering near record lows, and jobs in search of skilled workers often go wanting. Here to help us sort through it all, we welcome Andrew Parkin, director of the Mowat Centre and author of its report, A Different Ontario, Income and Employment, A Decade of Change. Julie Kwiaczynski, Director of Provincial Affairs for Ontario at the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, and Sheila Block, Senior Economist at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. And we are delighted to welcome you all to TVO tonight. Just as a way of setting this up, you two on the bookends are going to sit tight for a little while because this is Andrew's report, and you and I are going to start one-on-one off the top just to sort of set the table. You're our starting pitcher.
Excellent.
But it will set the table for the discussion to come here. Let's start with this. How do Ontario's employment income levels stack up when compared to other provinces?
Well, Ontario is still, relatively speaking, a wealthy province, but its income grew much more slowly than any other province over the decade before the last census. So we're looking up until the 2016 census, and essentially we were the last in the class in terms of growing the income. Quebec's income grew twice as fast as Ontarians did over that 10-year period. I think Alberta grew 6 times as fast, just in terms of the pace of change. So that doesn't mean we're a poor province.
The average income in Alberta grew 6 times faster than the average income in Ontario?
Yeah, over that decade period. Doesn't mean it's 6 times better. Right. It just means that their pace of change was much faster than Ontarians over that decade. Now, of course, since in Alberta, things have changed.
Indeed.
So again, Ontario is still one of the wealthiest provinces in Canada. But we have had a very difficult decade leading up to recent years.
How about in terms of whether men or women experienced the past decade in terms of economic advantage and income and so on? How did that look?
Yeah, in Ontario, it is quite different. These things do break down in a number of different ways, and they overlap in interesting ways. So certainly, men had a tougher time during that decade than women, which doesn't mean that men don't still earn more than women on average.
But they called it a he session for a reason.
Yeah, that's right. They were more likely to be in working in industries where employment was declining, and their income over that period, men as a whole, their income declined, whereas women's income did not. So the gap between what men and women in Ontario earn on average, the gap shrunk over that decade, which is good news. But some of that shrinkage was because men's income was declining, which is not the best way, I guess, to get to gender equity.
You would like gender equity because women's wages are going up as opposed to men's wages going down. Yeah. Okay, we got it. How about in terms of, as you look at the entire province of Ontario, region by region by region by region, how did it stack up that way?
Again, a lot of difference, which doesn't mean that that there were sort of huge boom areas. I think everyone had their own difficulties, but certainly you can map an arc kind of going from around Peterborough, Oshawa, then up to Barrie, and then down around all the way down to Windsor, sort of an arc around the GTA. Those areas had the toughest time over that period. In other words, employment incomes declined more sharply in those areas than they did in other parts of the province. Not surprising, those are areas where you would typically have seen more manufacturing, and again, that's the industry that during the recession and coming out of the recession got hit hardest. And it combines because of particularly men in those areas again. If you get to Windsor, if you look at men's employment income in Windsor over a 10-year period, as a whole declined 25%.
How about by age?
Young people, in this case, had a harder time. So the 25 to 34-year-old young adult, people starting their careers, moving into the labor force. Now, this doesn't mean that a young person starting out in 2005, for instance, lost income over that decade. What we're doing, we're comparing cohorts. What it means is young people today are starting at lower incomes than young people did 10 years ago. And again, it combines, so particularly young males in some of those regions in that arc around GTA, it all cascades on one factor after another. But it is true when we talk about millennials as a generation, and I think some people kind of roll their eyes when you bring up the plight of millennials, and yet the facts do show that that is a generation that's starting off behind the generation that came before them.
Is that taking inflation into account?
Yeah, that is taking. Yeah, this is all having taken inflation out of the equation. Essentially, this is real.
So apples to apples comparisons.
Apples to apples comparisons. Yeah.
I don't know if you get the numbers handy, but for example, 10 or 20 years ago, if you're a young person starting out in, 25 plus, what would your average income have been versus what it is now?
So I have the percentage change. So for instance, for young men in Ontario, they're starting out about 7% behind, as as a whole, on average, as a group, right? Doesn't mean that each and every individual is worse off. There's some people who are doing great, but as a whole, they're starting off about 7% lower than that age cohort did in 2005.
And yet many of them are trying to get into a housing market where the prices will be astronomically higher.
Absolutely, yeah.
That mismatch doesn't work too well, does it? How about if you are a recent immigrant to the province of Ontario? How would your income have looked compared to others?
Compared to others, of course, recent immigrants just starting out in a new labor market, so their incomes tend to be lower. But we looked at the comparison of recent immigrants today versus recent immigrants before. It's a trickier comparison. There doesn't seem to have been a sharp change there. But immigrants is a kind of catch-all category, and you have immigrants with different skill levels from different parts of the country. And I think thinking about immigrants as a whole is not always the sort of best handle. There are some immigrant groups, the immigrants who came here in the 1980s, for instance, on the whole, they're doing great.
Doesn't matter where they came from?
It doesn't matter where they came from, they're doing great now. But if you look at, and maybe not necessarily at immigrant categories, but at different racial groups in our society, there are definitely some, again, that are way ahead, and they're way ahead of where their parents were. So you've got that archetypal immigrant success story, right? The parents came, their incomes are lower than other Canadians maybe at first, but their children are going to do great. But there's other communities, there's the Black community in Ontario, the Latin American community, where the children are not doing as great as their parents, and that raises some real issues about what kind of barriers might be in the place that prevents that sort of immigrant success story from taking root.
So I want to make sure I get this. If you're comparing today versus a decade ago, and if you're, for example, from a racialized community or a visible minority, you're not doing better.
No, you have to break it down more because there's some visible minority communities, people of Chinese background, Japanese background, for instance, that our stats would classify them as part of Ontario's visible minority communities, but their incomes are growing and tend to be more successful generation to generation. So you have to bring a fairly fine analysis to this because just because those, as I said, those catch-all categories in our society, they don't always help. An immigrant is not an immigrant. Depends where you come from, where you came, what language you speak, what skills you came. Some are doing very well, and some are facing barriers.
Okay. Yeah. In the report, I want to pluck a quote out of here. You wrote, "This means that many young adults transitioning from education to work are starting their careers with lower pay than was the case 10 years ago." I mentioned the housing implications a second ago, but let's just sort of broaden that out a bit. As you consider those facts from now to 10 years down the road, what are the implications of that?
Well, the research tends to show that generations that are kind of come of age in a recession actually do always struggle to kind of keep up in that sense that this could have I'm trying not to be too much of a killjoy here, but
right.
A lingering effect for that generation as they they'll get into that great job that they've always been looking for. They'll get into that a little bit later, right? Their incomes will eventually grow, but it'll grow a little bit later. It'll affect their savings. It'll affect things over the course of their lives. But I do want to bring one more element into that discussion of youth because the aspect of education also still really matters here. So we've been sending the message to young people that education counts a lot. The more education you get, the better off you will be. And that's true.
The slogan I always heard was, the more you learn, the more you earn.
And it continues to be true. And it's worth emphasizing the point because if you look, for instance, at university-educated young people or college-educated young people, and you look at their income growth, it's not fantastic, right? Marginal. Over that 10-period time, you think, wow, but maybe a university degree isn't all it's kind of cracked up to be. And then you look at young people who didn't go to any form of post-secondary education at all, and they're much worse off. So I think those young people who are out there who have invested in their education and are experiencing this sort of longer transition in the labor force don't necessarily conclude that you made the wrong decision. Because the alternatives are certainly no better, and in some cases, bring much more difficulties with it. All of what we've been talking about sort of pick up the effects of changes in the labor market, right? And the way work is changing in a way that continues to put a premium on any form of education and training. The more you get, the more you earn, the more secure you'll be.
Gotcha. Just before we bring Julie and Sheila into this conversation and end the Parkin and Paikin part of the show, I do want to come back to something you said right off the top, which is you preface all of these remarks by saying Ontario is still a relatively wealthy province. And I think we need to understand better what that means, because certainly when I was a kid, this province was firing on all cylinders and was the unambiguous economic engine of the country. Is that still the case?
It's still the largest economy in the country. We're still home to many large and profitable businesses. We have neighborhoods in Toronto that have very large homes with very wealthy people living there. And that wealth is likely to congregate in a big city like Toronto. So if you want to ask where do wealthy people in Canada live, well, they live all over Canada, but many of them live right here. But I think what's changed, if you look at the West, for instance, when you were talking about your recollections, say 20, 30 years ago, the population difference between Ontario and the West was much greater. Right? We were still the biggest, but we were bigger by comparison. And the pace of growth was different. So we were growing and they were not growing so fast. Now the pace of growth in the country has shifted west. They are growing fastest. Their economies are growing faster, plus or minus an oil boom and bust cycle, but over the long term. And so I think, I guess I'm giving you a yes or no answer. Ontario's the biggest. I think we're the third wealthiest province, just measured in terms of household income. But the economic, over the life of the country, the economic center, I guess, has been, it used to be in Montreal and it was here, and now we're looking to Calgary and Vancouver. That doesn't mean that our days are done. It means that things are sort of evened out a little bit in the country.
Gotcha. Okay, let's get everybody into this right now. One of the reasons we wanted to have everybody here this day to have this conversation is that a couple of weeks ago, Premier Ford stood up in the legislature in answer to a question and surprised everybody by saying all those labor changes that came in under Kathleen Wynne's government under the title of Bill 148, we're going to scrap that. And I think it caught a lot of people unawares, but now we are starting to see the tangible evidence of what that actually means. And Sheldon, I'm going to ask our director, Sheldon Osmond, to bring up this graphic here to help take everybody through what the implications of a repealed Bill 148 means. The $1 increase that was scheduled to take effect January 1st will not take effect. So the minimum wage will stay at $14 an hour as opposed to rising to $15. 2 paid sick days, that's going to be eliminated as well. Employers will no longer be required to pay part-time employees the same wage as full-time employees who are doing the same job. That's going to go. Employees will no longer have a right to be paid for 3 hours of work if a scheduled shift is canceled within 48 hours notice. That was a provision of Bill 148. That's going to go. Employees will no longer be able to refuse to work on days that they weren't scheduled. Again, that was part of 148. Now it's gone. Let's get some feedback now on the nature of these changes and what we think of them. Julie, start us off. The general direction these changes take, your view.
Okay, so first let's talk about Bill 148, what that meant to small businesses. That's who I'm here representing, 42,000 small and medium-sized businesses across the province and across all sectors. Bill 148 was very unbalanced in terms of the workplace equation. It was very heavily centered on the employee. The employer was lost. There was no compassion shown whatsoever for people who create jobs in this province and take risks. So the new government came in, consulted on it. They talked to stakeholders like CFIB and other representatives
That's you
of
guys.
businesses.
You were talked to.
Yes, absolutely. And they listened. We told them things that we've been hearing anecdotally on the ground, Steve. And just as an example, one of the provisions was for on-call workers. So let's take the IT sector. If you're in the IT sector, I would say that most people don't make minimum wage. So the point I'm making here is for some businesses, the minimum wage was not an issue. It was the on-call provisions. IT sector, we had one company call us. These provisions, on-call provisions alone, will cost us an additional $150,000 a year, which equals 2 jobs. Another example, manufacturer, they said at a recent press conference, the gentleman said that they would have left Ontario had these changes not been made, and they were already starting to automate. So anecdotally on the ground, in spite of what you hear in the job numbers, Bill 148 was killing jobs, killing competitiveness, and in the end, if you're looking at the minimum wage worker, we've done our own numbers. The profile of the minimum wage earner in this province, Steve, almost 60% are young people between the ages of 15 and 24. 2.1% are single-parent families. And of those young people, they still live at home.
So the inference I draw here is that they are not necessarily the target group that is most desperately in need of a wage increase. Is that what I'm hearing?
I think the point I'm really making is if this was a bill to help people in low-income positions, then there's a better way to do it. The minimum wage is not the cure-all, the be-all, the panacea. And Bill 47, the new bill, what it does is it levels the playing field more on the employer side. There's more of a balance. There's compassion shown.
Hold off on 47 because we're going to get to that. But apropos of what you just said about who earns what, again, Sheldon, I'm going to ask you to bring up these pie charts right now because this will amplify on what Julie just said. Minimum wage earners in the province of Ontario, 84% earn more than the minimum wage, 16% are minimum wage earners. So we're talking about that 16% of the population. And if you look at how old they are, here's how that breaks down. 28% of them, almost 3 in 10, are between the ages of 15 and 19. You've got almost a quarter who are between 20 and 24. Another 1 in 5 who are 25 to 39. 16% only between the ages of 40 and 54, and then 55 plus is only 14%. So when Julie says the majority of people who are making minimum wage are younger people, the numbers seem to bear that out. Let's keep going. How about men versus women? Minimum wage earners in Ontario overwhelmingly are female, 58% to 42%. And how about minimum wage earners in Ontario in terms of firm size? You can see that 48% of minimum wage earners, so basically almost half, work at companies where you've got more than 500 employees. And there are fewer numbers as the number of employees in the companies go down as well. Okay, with all of that in place then, Sheila, you've heard kind of significant criticism over here about what Bill 148 was doing to those who create the jobs in Ontario. What would be your take on what 148's abilities were?
So I think we have to take a look at what Andrew was talking about in terms of the changes in the labor market. And what we really saw is the top half of those doing really well in Ontario. We saw increases in earnings, and where we really saw those losses was in the bottom half. And we've seen a big shift in the structure of employment, as Andrew was suggesting, where we have a shift from manufacturing to the service sector. And what Bill 148 was aimed at was really improving the working lives of low-income families who are aiming to support themselves and their kids. And as Julie suggested, it wasn't only about the minimum wage. It was about increasing fairness at work, and it was really about increasing the quality of life for people. So in terms of scheduling provisions, that means that it makes it a lot easier to work out your childcare arrangements. It makes it a lot easier if you're trying to do some education along with your part-time work to schedule your classes. Those are the kinds of functional issues that I think were really important. I also think Bill 148, in providing for sick leave, listened to physicians and listened to doctors in Ontario who said, from a public health perspective, the lack of those sick days means more people are going to spread infection. And from the efficient utilization of healthcare services, that having people sick people lining up in emergency rooms and doctors' offices was a really inefficient use of our health resources.
What about that notion that by taking away these provisions that would have made people's lives a little easier in the workplace, they will get sick more often, it will cost the healthcare system more money. At the end of the day, we're going to be further behind.
Well, I would make one suggestion, read Bill 47. You're not hearing in the media
That's the new one.
Yes, the new one, the new bill. There are 8 unpaid leaves. 3 of those are for personal illness, 2 for bereavement, 3 for family responsibility.
So you're content that there's still adequate provision in there to deal with the uncertainties of life?
But
Here's the
Julie,
point, Steve. That is a minimum prescribed item in legislation. Our business owners, we actually surveyed them, 84% of them already offer flexibility in the workplace. So the point I would make is this stuff is happening already. People are offering 2, 3, 4 paid sick days. These are minimum prescribed standards. Our members, small and medium-sized businesses, are already offering these things. They have a lovely, flexible environment. You come to the boss, my son is sick. They'll say, oh, just deal with it. We'll work it out later.
So we don't need a law on this, you're
No,
saying?
because what the law is doing, paper burden. You have to track everything, and you're mired in red tape.
Okay, Sheila wants back.
So, Julie, I think you're mistaken in your recollection of this because Bill 47 actually reduces the number of unpaid days that were available prior to Bill 148. And a really key measure here is about paid sick days. And absolutely, this is a floor. And with Bill 148 or without it, employers were always free to provide, to go above that floor.
Actually,
But-
Sheila, I'll have to correct you on that. Pre-Bill 148, there was a threshold of 50 employees for 10 unpaid days. So there were 10 unpaid days before Bill 148, but they didn't apply to small businesses.
Only for companies with more than 50 employees?
Exactly, Steve, yes.
And what this is doing is this is taking it down for everybody. Is that correct?
The threshold does not exist anymore. So the new government did not put the old threshold in so that these days apply to everybody. And also there's 5 paid days for domestic violence leave left untouched, 10 unpaid days. Nobody's talking about that. There are things in here that were not changed. And also, if I could reference Andrew's wonderful report where he talks about training, another hidden gem in Bill 47, the apprenticeship ratios are going down to 1-to-1.
We're going to get to
This
that in a
is
second.
huge.
Yeah, hang on, because no one knows what that means. So we'll get to that in a second. Can I? Okay, we've heard the dispute here. I want you to come in and just sort of bring the Mowat Center's view on who's right here.
Well, the Mowat Center will drive right down the middle on this, and that's not easy to do. Maybe just a couple of reminders. I think it's important to remember the minimum wage did go up on January 1st of this year, and that will remain in place. And if I'm not mistaken, it's delayed for a little bit, but indexation will come in. So part of the issue about the last minimum wage increase is that it hadn't increased. And it wasn't scheduled to increase, 25 cents, 50 cents, whatever dollar a year every 2 years. And that always gets you in a bind because when you do need to increase, it comes as a shock, right?
It went up 32% in 1 year.
Yeah. So if we can get out of that, that's a good first step. There are also other things that, we want to keep the conversation focused to a certain extent, but there are other things going on that can be offset in terms of income transfers. So there's been the last 2 or 3 years, there's been significant increase in child benefits paid to families. There's been changes in the workers' tax benefits so that low-income workers can keep more of the first dollars that they earn. That doesn't mean that you don't need to change anything else or so on, but there is a kind of wider context. There's a lot going on here. But I guess the only other thing I would try to say is what we were just trying to do is paint a context to say there's a reason why I think a lot of people in Ontario, both employees and employers, are feeling jumpy. We did lose 200,000 manufacturing jobs in that decade before the last census.
But we gained 500,000 jobs overall.
We did, but there were some people working in manufacturing industries, and there were some employers, right, who either had to contract or had to suspend business. So I think part of the reason this conversation is certainly a little edgy, that we can't just sort of take a step back and say, why don't we plan out the best labor force policy over the next 10 years, is because I think everyone, families, employees, and business people are all feeling that they've been through a tough time and that they've been under pressure and that they need some relief. And then you see sort of there's different answers to what the relief might be depending on your perspective and the position you sit in. But it's not for no reason that we're sort of having this conversation in a fairly tight environment.
I understand. But Sheila, let me follow up on something Julie said, which was she gave an example of a company that said, with all of these new provisions in place, it's going to cost me $150,000 more. That means there's 2 people I'm not going to hire. If the perverse effect of bringing in all of those labor changes, which you supported, is that fewer people are going to get hired, is it still a good thing to do?
I think we have to kind of step back from that. First of all, before the $14 minimum wage came into effect, we were hearing from the CFIB, from other business lobby groups, that really the sky would fall.
And it didn't.
Instead, and it absolutely didn't. And instead, what we actually saw was continued employment growth in Ontario. So I think one of the things that Andrew's report really brings out is that we have to not only look at the quantity of jobs, we have to look at job quality. And so if we're looking at what kinds of jobs are we creating, and what's the impact on our overall economy, I think we have to actually look at those kinds of things and say, you know what, quantity is no longer the correct measure. We want to look at job quality, and we want to also look at the quality of low-income workers' lives, and that was what Bill 148 was squarely aimed at.
Now, would you acknowledge that there were a lot of Chicken Littles out there saying the sky was going to fall?
The sky is falling.
Okay,
Steve,
go ahead.
I do want to talk about that. I've talked to a lot of business owners about this, and what they told me is their business decisions won't necessarily be felt right away, because what the business owner will do when faced with difficult choices, the small business owner, they, as a last resort, will want to get rid of a job. So they'll do other things. They'll curtail expansion plans, maybe curtail hiring plans just to keep that job intact. But now we're going into January 1st. More costs. New federally imposed carbon tax, that's coming down the pipe. Canada pension plan increases starting January 1st. That's an added pressure. So I think the jury should still be out on the final economic impact. You have the macro version, but anecdotally on the ground, that's not what I'm hearing. And I've got the frontline view. I get calls every day talking about this.
Okay, let me try one more example with Sheila, and that is, I talked to a college president a couple of months ago. So he runs a publicly funded institution. And he said, Bill 148, great, we get it, we understand why it's great for our employees, et cetera, et cetera. It's going to cost my institution $17 million to fulfill the provisions of Bill 148. All of these regulatory changes. Where am I, and he's asking the question, where am I going to get $17 million if not by charging higher tuition to my students, if not by trying to squeeze my staff, my professoriate, et cetera? That's an unintended consequence that presumably the previous Liberal government did not consider. And what's the answer?
Well, I think the answer to both what you and Julie are saying is no economist would tell you that you wouldn't have this kind of a change in economic conditions and in prices and not expect to have an impact. And so what this did is it actually rewarded high road employers who had been paying their employees more fairly, and it will require shifts. And so maybe those tenured professors will get a little bit less of an increase, and all those part-time folks who also have their doctorates and are also trying to publish and are working on contract will get a little bit more, will have an increasing share of that pie. It's really about, absolutely there are going to be behavior changes, but really this is about how we want to live as a society. And do we want to have a situation where people who are working full-time, full year, are living under the poverty line? And do we, in this situation, want to have people who are working side by side, doing the same work, and being paid very differently? And it has absolutely both public sector and private sector implications.
Okay, let's consider this next issue, which is, we have the lowest unemployment rate right now in the province of Ontario in what, 4 decades, something like that? 4 decades. And yet wages don't seem to be going up very much. Usually when there is a scarcity of labor, their wages go up because there's great competition among companies to get those employees. Sheila, start us off here. Why is that happening?
Well, I think since the minimum wage increase, we have seen an increase in wages. And that was part of the objective. So if you're looking at the hard data, if you're not looking at opinion or anecdote, but you're actually looking at the hard data, what you see is you see an increase in employment and you see an increase in wages. Now, I don't think all of that increase in wages actually has to do with the increase in the minimum wage. I think part of that does have to do with the tightness in the labor market that you're seeing at the moment. So over the longer run and over the period that Andrew's been looking at, yeah, we've had slow real wage growth, but that is starting to accelerate.
You want to weigh in on that?
I think I want to throw we mentioned pitchers before, so I'm not sure if this is a curveball or not. But one of the things that
Nice.
Good one.
Baseball analogy. Love it. Good.
I try. That we've noticed that we find interesting is we do some survey work as well, public opinion survey, just taking the pulse of Ontario. And coming out of the recession, one of the most notable things is the sort of anxiety that you would pick up about whether people are worried about losing their jobs or whether they think their children are going to end up better than themselves. As the economy started growing and the unemployment rate went back down, those attitudinal measures didn't shift. So not only do you raised the question of, how do you have very low unemployment and slow wage growth? And I think, in terms of kind of capturing the mood of the province, you have low unemployment, but high anxiety about employment and about the economy. And that's on the surface of it, a bit of a puzzle. I think if you kind of pull back and you start throwing things on the table that we haven't talked about yet, like trade with the United States, which anchors the Ontario economy and which has, been in question for at least 18 months
Tremendous
now.
flux. Yes.
Maybe now a little bit feeling a little bit better about that than we were a couple months ago. And then the whole, shift of the economy from having great small towns in Ontario with a local bookstore to everyone getting their books from Amazon, which may or may not employ anyone locally and so on. So there's a lot kind of going on around that makes, what does it mean to have 5% unemployment? It means something a little different right now than maybe it meant in, 1964.
Can you come in on that as well?
Yeah, I think the point that I really want to make is we put out a report called Help Wanted. It's a regular report. So for second quarter of 2018, it showed that in Ontario, we had 154,000 jobs that couldn't be filled because there were not suitable candidates, i.e. the people didn't have the skills to fill the jobs.
154,000 jobs
in Ontario.
left unfilled.
Yes.
Because you couldn't find skilled people to fill them.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's based on a survey of our members. So then you ask yourself, if you have a minimum wage earner, how do you potentially, maybe part of the problem is taking the minimum wage earner, giving them the skills that they need to move into higher paying jobs. I think that's something we should be looking at. I think we can do much better. We can do much better as a society. And we were always concerned, even with the previous government, we wanted to sit down and have that discussion, but we were not afforded the opportunity. Why is it $15? Where did that number come from? Pulled out of a hat. It's a sexy media slogan from the States, a union slogan, fairness for 15.
And fight for
but
15.
no one has ever said why it should be 15.
Well, let's ask Sheila. What was magic about $15 an hour?
So I just want to roll back to talk about the opportunity for consultation. The changes in Bill 148 actually came out of an expert panel that included a management side lawyer, very senior management side lawyer, very senior labor side lawyer, that did a two-year process called the Changing Workplace Review that had a lot of consultation associated with it. They did a final report that was, very thick.
419 pages.
I thought it was 16, but you might be right.
But the bottom, okay, so
the bottom line
there may
is-
have been
Might be right.
consultation,
There was
but,
a lot
but the
of
government clearly
consultation.
sided with one side over another.
I think that's a matter of debate. In terms of a minimum wage increase, there was siding with one side, but in terms of what folks were looking for, in terms of the changes in Bill 148, I think they kind of split it down the middle. And so I think what we have to be clear that there was a long consultation process, then the bill was introduced. There were public hearings across the province, after both first and second reading, which was unusual. So there was consultation. I think the business community in Ontario and across Canada has been unfamiliar with legislative changes that really provide the kind of support for people who are in working poverty that we saw with Bill 148.
Sheila's
and
missing a
that
very important point.
resulted really in a very, there was shock and awe from the business community. And I really think that kind of progress was really important given the kind of situation that Andrew has talked about and given the fact that working people in Ontario have really fallen behind over the last 15 years.
Down to our last couple of minutes. What's she missing?
Important point. Changing workplaces review, minimum wage was excluded, Sheila, from the consultations.
What does that mean?
It was not to be talked about, not to be talked about. The previous government had already decided in 2014 to index the minimum wage to inflation based on another consultation. So they were going to park the minimum wage, and even the Minister of Labour, the previous minister, said they weren't going to even look at it till 2019 or 2020. We were shocked, appalled, and bamboozled.
They changed their mind.
And further to your comment about consultations, we actually looked at how many people were allowed to present to committee representing the business community. It was heavily weighted on the side of unions. As a matter of fact, Steve, in Windsor, the same union presented 3 times under a different umbrella, like youth, women, and the general.
Okay, here's
the general.
Everybody's got to
union.
forgive me. Here's where I got to jump in because we're in the bottom of the 9th and we just got 3 outs. We're out of time. But I have just 10 seconds left to thank everybody for coming in today, because this was a great discussion. We didn't get to apprentices, but we'll have to get to that next time. Julie Kwiaczynski from the Ontario Division at the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. And then Andrew Parkin from the Mowat Centre and Sheila Block from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. Great discussion, everybody. Thanks so much for coming in at TVO tonight and helping us out with this.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario, helping businesses stay on the right side of change with strategic thinking, insightful decisions, and business leadership. Are you on the right side of change? Ask an Ontario CPA.